Welcome back, everyone. This is the Poor Proles Almanac, as always, and once again, we're talking about canning. Sort of.
Sort of canning. The best kind of canning.
Sicilian canning, specifically.
Okay, so is this like a method or like what?
No,
How
so,
we do it?
so it's actually Sicilians canning things. Like, specific Sicilians, not like some random, some old Sicilian dude.
Okay, well they must be like kind of specific to canning, right? Or are you just like is
No,
it
no,
just a memory?
we're getting a little semantic here.
I thought you said Sicilian.
Oh, Matthew. All right, so let's back up a bit. While many people know where Sicily is, that it's at the toe of the boot of Italy, many people don't realize that Italy is kind of like the US in the sense that the further south you go, the poorer it is, the hotter it is. It's a tough place to grow food, and historically, the ocean has been kind of the primary food source.
And one thing I do know is the government has not been great.
Yeah, that's also something that's been a perpetual problem, like just in general in Italy, terrible government. When the sardine fishing dried up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the fishing communities that relied on the sardines, because that was their primary source of food and income for the region, decided it was time to start over somewhere else. Some began to shift their fishing routes farther out, going to North Africa, following the fishing seasons, while others expanded their sites and heard about this wonderful land called California, a place with great fishing and a more temperate climate.
And I kind of like to think that's the only thing that they had ever heard about California. Just totally unprepared for everything else.
Oh, probably. Now, the town of Monterey at the time had only recently become an American town. It was primarily for commercial fishing for whales, abalone, salmon, and a variety of other species that had fed the region for centuries. And this was largely done by immigrant laborers from Asia, as well as Mexican residents who had lived there longer than the American government had had authority of Monterey.
And the American government respected that seniority, right?
Obviously. They had fished for sardines in Europe, which existed in California, but were never really seen as a real potential for like scalable fishing.
Okay, I see where this is going.
So sardines became a commercial enterprise in California in 1902 when one cannery was established on Fisherman's Wharf. The cannery owner, a guy named Frank Book, recruited a Norwegian immigrant, Knut Hovden, to help him develop the cannery into like a real business. And to do that, they hired a young Sicilian fisherman, a guy named Pietro Ferranti, and his brother Orazio Enea, who worked together to organize a group of fishermen to focus on sardine fishing. Big shock, people have been doing this for generations. The industry exploded, and the sardine fishing boom continued for at least 28 years.
Okay, they made someone an offer they couldn't receive.
Receive? The offer was a fish.
Just little ones, though.
Okay. Little fish. I will say, if you are not used to eating sardines, little fish, especially if you're in Europe, in Italy at least, it's very common to fry the fish whole. So like you'll see like their little heads like with their eyes sticking out, like still there. And yeah, if you're not an American who's not used to that, that can be really intimidating. Just a plate full of basically flash fried fish with their eyes just staring at you.
Sounds pretty good.
Not my problem, but I've seen some people, I've seen Americans be like, what did I just order? I ordered the fish. That's not what I thought.
And then you're producing some real like cartoon trash.
You could.
Just like a fish skeleton, head and tail.
Yeah. Now, now the reason they weren't harvested heavily wasn't because Americans were afraid of eating their heads. It was that processing them was difficult. So like you have to gut the fish because they're still fish and they're tiny. And that means there's a lot of them that need to be gutted to sell it at scale, right?
Not to mention how long it takes to fucking jam them all in there.
Yes, by hand, one at a time. Sardine fishing is also a fairly short season industry, not compared to like, I don't know, harvesting tomatoes, but it's fairly short. It's only typically like a 7-month season. For Sicilians, it was still a reminder of home, and it was a rare opportunity to work in a nation that still treated Italians and especially Sicilians as second-class citizens. For Sicilian women in particular, who we're going to spend most of this episode talking about, It was an opportunity to marry economic freedom with the other freedoms that they had enjoyed overseas back at home. For folks that are not familiar with fishing communities, Sicily lives in the same space as most fishing communities, and if anything, was a little bit more extreme in the way that they understood the roles, the gender dynamics, and things like that within a household. So, to put this in context, most of the women in Sicilian households were, at least for fishing communities, were the primary decision makers and considered, independent members of the family, not subservient to their husbands. This wasn't because Sicily was like a progressive paradise, but it reflected their lived reality, which is that their husbands would go on boats and they would return home after days, weeks, or even months at sea, or they would just never come home at all.
Yeah, like fishing is one of the most dangerous jobs on earth, if not like the most dangerous job, especially back then. It's like going out into the ocean. A lot of stuff happens out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, and it was because of this, it was necessary not just for women to manage family affairs, but for that designation to be socially acceptable and almost valued, right? Because women needed to keep things going. Men were gone and they had to make it work, right? And it was about honor of being able to keep the household running, right? Because of this, a lot of fishing communities became overwhelmingly female spaces. Now, a guy named James McGoodwin, who's a marine anthropologist, describes it as follows. The life situations of fishermen's wives and their central role in the economic and social affairs of their communities contribute importantly to the distinctive character of fishing cultures. And many fishing communities manifest tendencies towards matriarchy and matrifocality.
That's a $3 word right there.
Yeah, fucking nerds. Just can't let them write a book. This is what happens.
But I mean, like, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're building like economic and social relations or like, I don't know, a cannery, it's got to be with people that you're like pretty certain aren't about to like disappear into the sea.
Yeah, and like I said, this was not unique specifically to Sicily. If you look at fishing communities in like South India, West Africa, Japan, basically anywhere on the coast, women were often much more responsible for keeping the community and family organized and functioning and often fulfilling those traditional roles we think of as a father, as well as being a mother. Another person, Leonarda Vaccaro, uses the term, quote unquote, little matriarchies to describe small Sicilian fishing villages and their gender roles. Their ability to exist both independently for their families while nested within, a group or a consortium of women prepared them for like the fierce demands that came when they got dropped into basically these assembly lines during canning season. And they would hear the cannery whistles blowing at like any hour, day or night, and it was like the fish have come in, time to come to work.
I mean, that's a fantastic term, little matriarchies. And it's so we were talking just before we recorded like how interesting it is that it's somewhat like universal across all the world's coasts. This like development of like relation that has to like exist, that has the opportunity to exist there because it's had. That's not a very good way of putting it.
It's interesting from my perspective because it's like this idea of like you hold up a mirror to a mirror and then you like can see like that slow adjustment, right? Where it's like the same image but slightly different, like like an infinite amount of times. And that's like what a lot of humans have existed on the landscape, right? Like all these fishing villages, they're not the same. They're all within those specific material conditions, but they still share 90% of the same stuff because of the way that they relate with the landscape around them. Even if it's not the same plants, the same fish, the same history, they share 90% of what it means to be human and to live on that landscape.
Yeah. The context of the environment they're in has like a, overwhelming influence on the material conditions.
Yes, this is exactly what Marx was saying.
Yeah. I know. I thought he had I don't know where that chapter went.
Working class Sicilian women were hired en masse to fill the assembly lines for processing sardines. They provided the labor to build a new industry, and as it grew, immigrants from across the continent arrived to fill that demand and that labor. They followed the lead of the Sicilian women who had since organized under the industry's attempt to exploit their non-citizen labor force. Now, to understand the significance of the wave of Sicilians who arrived, consider that in 1910, the population of Monterey County was 11,300. Of those, 36 were Italian. 4 years later, in 1914, 4,000 Sicilians arrived.
Ooh.
That's like a third of the population, right? The strong identity of the Sicilian women meant that when they entered the workforce, instead of the work forcing them to assimilate into American culture, they could instead force the culture to assimilate to them and force themselves as a community to assimilate only to that specific work environment. By the 1930s, as influxes of new immigrants arrived, they did shrink, but they still remained 1/3 of the cannery workforce and culturally the largest bloc.
I mean, that's an insanely large population of like a very small and specific ethnic group, like in one place, one industry.
Yeah, I think if you're from like a very multicultural place, you're like, oh, like yeah, there's a lot of this group, but it's like, imagine if like one of 3 people in a small town in Greece was from New Jersey
In 3 years.
in 3 years.
Yeah, yeah, from New Jersey. I mean, that's a hell of a visual. Can you imagine them like trying to bring New Jersey identity to like Greece? I think yeah.
Yeah, it would be bad. Like the Jersey Shore Festival would just absolutely the Greek mind cannot comprehend.
Yeah. You know, I just saw something about like the Greek islands are going through like a depopulation crisis. Maybe we just pitched them a whole bunch of New Jerseyans.
Exactly. I think this is the next bumper sticker is bring New Jersey back to Greece. Never explain it.
Make Greece New Jersey again.
I love it. We're doing it. I think everyone is on board with this.
Yeah, we're gonna get a call from like the Greek consulate.
Yes,
They're like,
you're welcome, Greece. You're welcome.
Stop this anti-Greek agitprop.
Someone had to do it. It's not our fault. We were just the man for the job. We didn't choose it. It chose us.
And the money. Well, and when we chose the money.
Well, obviously, yeah. The heavy funding from the Trump administration to get rid of as many New Jerseyans as possible.
Yeah, and you would not believe how quickly that money flows. They're just throwing it out the windows.
It's like a faucet. You just can't stop it. Speaking of faucets,
okay.
Sorry, I have to cut you off for an actual brand conversation. Sorry, Matt. You're about to experience something. He has no idea what's coming, everyone. So,
God.
About a month ago, we get ad proposals all the time, and one of them is for deodorant. I don't know if you get the advertisings on Instagram all the time. Mando?
No.
Okay, so I got this brand. They sent me stuff, and I'm not a brand person. I know that's a shock to you, Matt. You've seen the clothes that I wear.
Yeah.
But I always have a rash issue with deodorant. So I tried it. I was like, sure, let me give it a try. It's the first deodorant that did not, worked fine. So shout out to Mando. If you need deodorant, they got you. If you've got very sensitive skin, those are my people. So I've been converted. This is the only brand I've ever been like, I will buy your product. So shout out to Mando. Good job, guys. You're making good deodorant. Matt, Matt doesn't even know what to say to this.
Nope. I don't.
Anyways.
What were you talking about?
The fish guts is actually what we're talking about. Speaking of smells. So yeah, we talked about the Sicilian women and their huge population of it, right? In the community. So they had this huge power because they all spoke Sicilian. They could all work together and they all had each other's back, right? So if people were exhausted, which happened, they would, help each other out, cover each other's backs if they were falling asleep on the job, whatever. They would come home from work and they would smell like fish because you're gutting fish for 12 hours. Of course you are.
Happens.
But they would wear it as a badge of pride. They did not buy Mando. They just smelled like fish. Matt's loving this. He is so broken by me talking about deodorant.
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. So for these folks in Sicily, the fact that they could do this for their community showed that they could do critical labor in order to provide for their family. It was a new way for women that had always kind of felt like made, powerful in their community, but never financially responsible for bringing in money to like enter this new space of like independence, right? Or interdependence, giving back to their community. Now, given the poor working conditions, it shouldn't be a huge surprise that it wasn't too long until there was union discussion in the canneries. I know this is a big surprise, but in the 1930s, canneries weren't exactly like open, OSHA-friendly spaces. They were dark, they were noisy, they were cold because didn't want the fish to go to rot, right? They were moist because water was constantly running on the floors. It was just, wet and cold and dark and loud, the way everyone likes to spend 12 hours a day.
Plus that smell. Nothing like bulk fish guts in the morning.
Yeah, you just take a hit of that and you're good.
The morning being like 3:30 a.m.
Yeah. So for many of the Sicilian women that had watched as their husbands organized with the American Federation of Labor, they believed that their labor was like crucial for the success of their husbands as they were fishing. And they were, I would say, less interested, but not against unionizing in the canneries, because for them, mostly that money wasn't like this is what we need to do to survive. There were, but not all of them, not most of them. It was more about supporting their husbands in a different way and having a little bit of money for future planning. It was about making sure that their husbands had long-term financial success so that they could manage it back at home.
Okay, so it was basically like we don't really care about forming a union because our husbands are the breadwinners and we don't want to jeopardize like the success of that union.
Yeah, basically, I think that's like the best way to describe it. In Carolyn McGibbon's book, Beyond Cannery Row, which is a really interesting read about this subject, she describes her interviews with many of the women who had worked the canning lines, and she articulates in the book that, in quote, Sicilian women expressed a perception of identity as working class as too limited and never seemed to believe that unions alone would allow them the upward mobility economically that they sought, end quote. One of the women she interviewed, a woman named Dolly Orsino, articulated a similar feeling, and she said, and I thought this was a really interesting quote, "We were cannery workers, sure, but the most important thing was being Italian, being part of our families." Now, this idea allowed them to like blend their cultural identity into their work and their husband's work, which were all part of this like similar thread, right? So like their identity wasn't tied specifically to the work that they did. So they didn't need to necessarily prioritize their work and the dignity of their perceptions of themselves at work because it was just a job. It wasn't a career. And I think this ability also kept their Sicilian identity from bleeding away into like the greater American landscape.
I mean, it's a bit of an interesting perspective, right? Like their economic value wasn't really as important as long as they knew that it like wouldn't impede their primary concern, which was like their family and their like husband's financial success. Not in like a patriarchal way, but more like it wasn't a career, it was just like a job and the money was like enough to do what they needed to do.
Yeah, it was very much like a complementary thing to their identity. It wasn't the focal point. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when, we're thinking about like, well, they weren't actively doing like all this stuff for union organizing. So are they like anti-working class or like, why are we talking about them then if they don't do these very like hard and firm like things that we consider like part of, organizing the working class? But I think it's really important because as the unions organized and succeeded and the cannery lines got unionized, a number of unintended consequences came up. And it speaks to why they didn't particularly care about unionizing. So as the union stepped in, the unique challenges of being a woman in the workplace were largely ignored. The big one being specifically childcare. Now, while this was a major issue for many of the women on the factory line, for the Sicilian women, those traditional gender roles didn't necessarily apply. So to go back to like the cultural norm, many fishermen took on more domestic roles when they were home for long stretches at a time, like in between different like seasons of fishing. So, for example, a guy who was interviewed for that book, Cannery Row, that I mentioned, a guy named George Salamento, he said, I would keep an eye on the kids, give them a bath, clean up the house a little. I would hang up the clothes and clean the kitchen floor. She was tired. Sometimes I would put on a pot of soup or something.
I mean, I don't know, it's not really much today, but like in 1920, that seems pretty radical.
Yeah, I mean, when the idea of a man even allowing his wife, and I'm using it in that 1940s, 30s, 20s terms, allowing his wife to work, never mind being like, she's the one working and I'm home with the kids. And like, also, I'm supporting her in that work is really impressive. At least I think so.
Yeah.
And to that point, like, this wasn't really something new to Sicilian fishing communities. Now, on site care for children did come in the 1940s, but it took a decade just about for that to get there. And Sicilian women really had no interest in utilizing it because instead they would rely on like kin networks instead. So often what would happen is mothers who didn't work would take on their siblings' children, allowing those other women to work when necessary. And again, if you think about it like as this matriarchal society where these women organized together, while she may have been the one earning money, there was an understanding that this was, kind of an equal informal partnership. And this allowed for the Sicilian women to kind of snub any piecemeal proposals from employers because their communities provided the resources they needed. Work was just simply like this extra money. But ultimately, like when push came to shove, it wasn't a desperation for the job to provide. It was my community will provide. And for a lot of these Sicilian women, these jobs weren't ever meant to be permanent, but again, just kind of a stepping stone for temporary cash and to support their husbands. And for many of these women, it was primarily to develop the resources for a deposit for either an investment or a bigger fishing boat. And like I said, even sometimes it was just for like spending money for young women that wanted to like go out with their friends.
A little bit of fuck you money.
Yeah, basically. So their relationship with this work was largely different because they had a strong support network outside of that work. Beyond that childcare, many Sicilian women participated in communal money lending for other immigrant Sicilians. This wasn't just about like supporting their husbands, it actually allowed for higher divorce rates in Sicilian communities. Again, we're talking the 1920s and 30s and 40s, where divorce rates were very, very low here in the United States. And it reinforced that idea of like interdependency as they borrowed money from each other when they needed, knowing that each of them, even if they didn't have a job, was good for it. And when those women did need a divorce, it was socially expected that their parents would support them and provide them with a place to live. Again, making it possible for these women, even if they weren't necessarily like financially independent, working a full-time job, living in their own apartment, whatever, to have this sense of like, I have the capacity and authority to make a lot of decisions without it being tied down in like, well, I don't have a full-time job. My kids, my husband, so-and-so need me. They control what my day-to-day looks like. They didn't have that.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it on here before, and it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but like how important a healthy divorce rate in a community is. And like while like the taboo against divorce can be strong, like a actual like lack of community support from outside the marriage can be like just as much, if not like more of a reason to stay in a bad marriage.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this interdependency existed beyond these like fiscally related needs. And I mean, beyond the watching someone else's kid or funding someone's new venture into whatever it might be, there was this really great sense of kinship. And this was framed in this idea of like constant hospitality and frequent visits to friends and family. This diversity of community support allowed women to invest with one another, to run ideas across one another. This even included buying rental properties in Monterey in their own names as early as the 1920s, including 20% of the rentals in the city in 1924. That sounds like a lot for the small percentage. And again, considering immigrant communities generally don't have a lot of capital investment in communities. But for context, that really drives home like why this is like a major deal is that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1974. And it was only 50 years after that 20% of rentals were owned by women that banks were forced to allow unmarried women to even get mortgages.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure things weren't perfect or like, but honestly, I get why they basically wanted nothing to do with non-Sicilian culture. Like for a woman, it sounded like there was a lot to lose and little to gain. Not to mention being like 50 years ahead of the curve when buying property. And honestly, it's like as far as American real estate goes, was I feel like that was like pretty important 50 years.
Oh, you mean when you could buy a house for like $300 and like a bag of hamburgers?
Yeah, and a bag of beans.
Yeah. And again, so to get back to this cannery thing, their roles in the canneries were not just about making money, but also, supporting their husbands' industries so that they would be successful. And in many cases, the women would be canning the exact fish their husbands had brought in only a few hours before, which is like kind of cool. Now, outside of the canneries, these groups of women organized around what's called the festa in Sicilian. According to legend, in approximately the year 1100, Santa Rosalia, a young girl from the aristocracy, renounced worldly goods and chose instead to live in a cave as a religious recluse, where she would eventually die. Her bones were later found, and a man was told in the vision to carry the bones through the town and give her a proper burial. In return, God would take his life in place of his wife's life, who was sick during the Black Plague. Immediately after the bones were buried, the Black Plague left the town, and when the man died, his wife lived. Afterwards, Santa Rosalia was worshipped as the patron saint of Palermo, the largest Sicilian city for the fishing population on the west coast. This celebration carried to California, where women looked to Santa Rosalia for guidance and hope.
So kind of everything goes back to the Black Plague.
Yeah, basically.
We're learning once again.
If there's anything I've learned in life, it's probably because of the Black Plague. Those freaking mice, I'm telling you.
I swear to God. And you're always saying that.
I am. It's those mice, man. You just gotta get some cats or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Wash your hands.
No, I'm not gonna do that, Matt. I got deodorant now. What more do you want from me? I can only do so much before I become civilized. Don't push your luck. Now, these gatherings for the women where they would come together in these kin groups would provide a space for like the free flow of ideas and for women to dare to imagine a future in Monterey. And this began with those various like festas, right? Or beginning to organize around these festas. So public celebrations of Italian culture, of Sicilian culture, would become like this really important healing process for these people who had settled in the New World, who were learning new languages, learning new expectations, realizing and living the anxiety about their decision to move if it was a mistake, the loss of connection to family members who had once lived very close by, and in those later years in the 40s, the increasing pressure of the impending war. Now, part of the success of these celebrations came from the political power Sicilians had within the community, which forced the region to recognize the pagan nature of the festa despite the failures of Italian celebrations in many other parts of the country. Their goal was to create a ritual space where Sicilians could come together as one community, and it was a way to integrate new and old generations of immigrants into a common, cohesive identity.
Yeah, I mean, like ushering people into community instead of like looking for reasons to kick people out. I feel like the left could take something from that.
No, we can't. We're perfect. We've figured it out.
Yeah.
We're good.
Oh, I forgot about that bit.
Except for you. We kicked you out specifically.
Oh, shit. Now what am I going to do?
I don't know. You're going to have to go join MAGA. I see that red hat. It's coming.
Yeah.
Now, these festas fostered this idea of community building, and it allowed for a lot of connections for women, for people that would recently have joined the community, where they could meet with other women and kind of learn how to become integrated into the community. These gatherings would help women develop these deeper relationships beyond their immediate family and village. Oftentimes, these were kind of ritualistic and exclusive. And by exclusive, I mean not like you had to be the cool kids from Sicily. It was more like specifically Sicilians and even excluding Italians. So, for example, one group was the rosary groups, and these were just informal prayer groups. The women would say a rosary and then have coffee and cake, and they would use this religious formality to spend time together and to have an excuse to build relationships, right? It wasn't about the rosary. It was about the getting everyone in the same room and breaking the ice. Beyond the rosary groups, women would have sewing groups, embroidery groups, and even card playing groups. So it was almost like these affinity groups, right? where people would, they would get into this network and then kind of figure out where they fit in, right? But it was a way for there to be cross-pollination and kind of a confederation of different organizing, right? What was less important was the consistency in the group, and more important, the commitment to the group. And what I mean is that you didn't have to always show up, but you would be required to like take a turn hosting the group, bringing things, food, whatever it might be, to the group. And again, people would get involved with these based on what they were particularly interested in. Now, because of their freedom, because of their husband's work where they would be away for long periods of time, their lifestyles demanded this community support in a way that like conventional American culture could never really provide. The expansion of domestic management expanded beyond the traditional roles of those nuclear families, and decision-making was done through a wider circle of these kin and comares that made up their communities and affinity groups. In practice, what that really meant was like a group chat, right? Like a group text today, where you would basically have your friends and allow them to voice their opinions on a situation, whether it was your kid wanted to go to this thing, you would run it by all your friends and be like, what are your thoughts about this? What should I do? And they knew your kid and they knew your life, and they could try to give you like meaningful advice, but it carried a lot of weight in the way the community organized, and that everyone knew and expected that if a mother made a decision, that if the other mothers saw that kid out on the street, they knew that kid wasn't supposed to be there. So it created a network of support and accountability in a way that a group chat doesn't necessarily do that. Further, their understanding of like control was very different than I think we think of here in conventional like American society. So for example, children were given a lot of leeway to find independence in small ways. And this would be like unofficial approval from their mothers and not from their fathers. So, a mom telling her kid that they can do this thing with the understanding that this is not something to be shared or made public, and the father probably knew about it and didn't agree with it, but they just never talked about it. One of those kinds of things. And that for Sicilian culture would be like dating non-Sicilians. It was like, yeah, you can do that, but we do expect you to still marry a Sicilian someday, but like have your fun now while you're young. And like if you don't marry a Sicilian, at least an Italian, maybe a Portuguese, or at the very least Catholic. So like it wasn't a firm thing. It was usually like, we're going to give you some leeway, and then there's like certain guidelines you kind of don't cross, right? And this also allowed for a lot of support when people made decisions. There's flexibility with an understanding of firmness of if you cross this line, then that's where the real repercussions come. But we're going to try to keep you from ever even getting there. So another example is like if husbands were abusive, those groups of women would support woman leaving her husband. And these women demanded dignity for divorced women, despite, again, that cultural power in the rest of America of like, oh, how did you fail in your marriage as a woman?
I don't know, Andy. Divorced women, dignity. This is all sounding a bit radical.
Yeah, I know. We're gonna start scaring the town folks with this radical talk. Now, this isn't all to say that things were perfect in Sicilian communities. Like I just hinted, intermarriage with non-Sicilians was still pretty frowned upon. Many times it was expected that you would only associate with other Sicilians. Again, flexibility with that firm boundary of like, yeah, you can do this stuff. Maybe we don't really talk about it, but there's a line you don't cross, right? So in many ways, like this old world had arrived in the new world, and many didn't want to forge a new path forward, but remain static in basically the exact ways of the past. In many ways, the community was too closely based on this like ethnic isolationism that if someone did marry another person outside of that spectrum of acceptable partners, that they would get explicitly cut out from Italian or Sicilian community. And this was made worse or magnified if the potential partner or the partner didn't have economic means. So it was one thing to like marry a Spanish or Mexican person. It could potentially be salvageable if they were Catholic, yada, yada, yada. But if they also didn't have like financial means to improve their family's economic position, like collectively, then like it was like, oh, okay, that's too far. To put that in context, like there are interviews with daughters who would work and give their entire paycheck to their family for the greater good of the household. And if they married someone that was unacceptable, their family would just like cut them out of their lives despite like all that financial support.
Well, that's a lot less fun. But I guess it means, however, that we're still talking about like the Sicilians as a distinct group.
Yeah, I mean, it allowed their community to thrive in a lot of ways within their own economic ecosystem. And again, Sicilians didn't do a whole lot to try to even engage with the greater community. And despite making up a majority of the region's citizens, by the 1940s, as the World War II ramped up, none of the government officials had an Italian surname. So, like, despite being the majority of the population, they had no representation outside of their community. Part of this is because, like, as we said earlier, you mentioned earlier, the government in Sicily wasn't great. They wanted nothing to do with government because it had always been abusive to them, so they just tried to fly under the radar, for better or worse.
Foreshadowing music. Dun dun dun.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Sicilians became a focal point of news in the community. And I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here, because a lot of Sicilians supported Mussolini, mostly because they felt he was going to bring law to Italy. And again, given the fact that the government was a shit show for their entire lives, I can kind of understand why they would be like, well, oh, someone's going to like take care of these crooked politicians. Great. You know, it's a government that hadn't been able to provide like fundamental basic services for decades. So like, I get it, but also I understand why Americans like weren't really trusting them.
Yeah, because as it turns out, not a great guy.
Turns out. And I think it's also worth remembering how, and I'm not just defending them because I'm also Italian, but there was very little information that traveled across the globe at that time. It's not like today where you can get daily updates, right? Further, like, and I don't think Americans have a very good understanding of like how fascism existed in the 40s, but like Mussolini invested heavily in developing support from Italian Americans here in the United States and funded things like Italian language education programs and like other after school programs, all this other stuff for Italian identity across the country. But he specifically targeted places like California, where he knew there were large portions of Italians, and he advocated for what he called a new ethnic assertiveness for Italian American immigrants to be proud of their culture, their identity, and where they came from.
Yeah, I mean, after what we've just talked about, it's not hard to see why this rhetoric had appeal.
Yeah, and it was only when like Italy invaded North Africa, like where many of those same Sicilians had worked prior to moving to Monterey, that like the reality of what Mussolini was trying to do became apparent. And fortunately, he, in defense of our Sicilian comrades here in the United States, he did lose a lot of support that he had originally had from those Italian Americans.
I mean, better late than never.
Yeah, and despite that, things got pretty bad for Sicilians and Italians in general. For example, the Alien Registration Act was signed into law in June of 1940. This act required the registration and fingerprinting of all aliens aged 14 and older, along with extensive and intrusive questionnaires. Very shortly after war was declared on Italy, and Sicilians were basically cut off from communication with family overseas, and unsurprisingly, faced a lot of hostility here in the United States. Now, the Roberts Commission issued a report in 1942 which charged Japanese Americans with complicity with the assault on Pearl Harbor. This had greater complications for like anyone related to German, Japanese, Italian descent. Basically, Americans are like, we don't trust you, we know where you come from. I know people are familiar with like the Japanese internment camps. Italians were never put into internment camps, but many of them were rounded up and arrested just for being non-citizens, including several men from Monterey. Italians who hadn't become American citizens were considered dangerous nationals, and that is a government-designated term, dangerous nationals. And they were forced to evacuate the coast of Monterey for an indefinite period because they didn't want them having access to leaving the country.
I mean, slightly better than the Japanese, but man,
Not great.
yeah, it's pretty low benchmark.
Yeah. The government decided that it was only American citizens who were allowed to run fishing boats out of Monterey or work in the Canneries moving forward. So it was because of this that a lot of Sicilians had a vested interest to gain citizenship and to basically align themselves with whiteness as much as possible, which would allow them to regain a lot of their basic civil rights. However, Executive Order number 9066, which I know you know off the top of your head, Matt,
Of course.
it upended any chance of Americans or Sicilians to Americanize, as it gave the military full discretion in evacuating the coast of anyone considered an enemy alien, regardless of citizenship status.
I mean, 1942, but somehow seems pretty fucking relevant to 2025.
Yeah, Trump is doing his best to like really bring this one back. If we hear the Executive Order 9066 again, you guys will know you heard it here first. And this is partly why I wanted to do this episode now, because a lot of that early work of like racializing and marginalizing communities, especially immigrant communities, this is like a pretty good playbook of what you might expect to see. But to get back to the Sicilians that we're talking about, to give you some context of like what the hell was happening and like how you had this weird dichotomy of communities that were largely immigrant, non-citizen, who provided a very important service in their community, being cut off from those resources and also basically being alienated in the greater community. There's a newspaper article in Monterey. Has a really interesting quote, and there's a couple titles we're going to cover in a minute. But the quote says, "The original order covered enemy aliens living within 100 designated areas in California, Oregon, and Washington. With its new power, the Army, if it wishes, can sweep the state clean of not only enemy aliens, but their American-born children as well."
Jesus Christ, it really is the same.
Yeah. So the government used the executive order to scare Sicilians into either leaving, or basically they would show up and seize their assets, even from American citizens. These enemy aliens...
Illegal aliens?
Enemy aliens. Even worse, to be honest.
Alien.
These enemy aliens were required to be inside their homes by 8 p.m. every night. So the war basically fundamentally upended their lives. They couldn't work the weird hours required for their jobs as fishermen or in canneries. They gave up assets or were forced completely out of the town where it was the only place they knew people. And these challenges were particularly difficult for women. Many of the Sicilian women learned very little English, few were even literate in Italian. Most could not pass a citizenship exam. Despite managing the household responsibilities, they were the most vulnerable in the eyes of the government. Even women born in the United States carried more risks when they married Italians from overseas, including surprise inspections and FBI raids. The newspapers read these really interesting contradictory articles side by side that, for example, alien raids were continuing, but the canneries and the fishing needed to meet higher and higher productivity to support the war efforts couldn't find people to do the work.
Yeah. Wow, this is definitely something that we learned from and aren't doing again, literally, as we record this.
Right? And despite these challenges, the matriarchy's strong fiscal management kept Sicilians from becoming public enemies along with the Japanese. I mean, granted, the Italians never dropped a bomb on or attacked an American city, but part of the reason why they didn't get the same treatment as the Japanese is that the Sicilians and Italians collaborated to invest a lot of the profits that they had made heavily in supporting the war efforts and donating publicly to the government through war bonds and fishing boat donations, since they couldn't use the fishing boats anyway. Now, this could only be done because of the community's financial success. Alongside newspaper articles describing how Americans were the only ones now fishing in Monterey, were advertisements showing the donations made by Italian groups, Italian American clubs, and so on, proof that, Italians were behind the war efforts and all that good stuff too. These groups that organized also funded Italians that were running for office into the 1940s, and this had several benefits, not just to have a representative in the government, but it did things like it forced the police force in Monterey to have Italian translators. So people could at least get their rights read to them.
Okay, so basically they had to become a PR wing for an ethnic group.
Yeah, basically. And I know it's not a popular thing to say, but that's also how the Zapatistas survive, right? They focus on PR. If nobody knows what's happening there or cares what's happening there, Mexico's just going to go and take it over, right? It's not an issue of the Mexican government not having the military to go into Zapatista territory. That's not the issue. It's the public outcry that would come from that, right? And that's even the same in Rojava. The reason why Rojava has succeeded is because it has support from the United States as a specific outpost that has like these dynamic power changes within that region, and they do a really good job of PR. So when we talk about PR, it's not a bad thing. It was integral for the Sicilians and the Italians to like showcase that they were behind the war efforts, that they didn't support the fascism in Italy. And this also changed a lot of the way that Sicilians and Italians engaged with like greater society. After the war, people were expected to get their American citizenship as soon as possible. Marriage with non-Sicilians was suddenly welcomed. The Santa Rosalia Festa was Americanized and became like a big non-Sicilian thing. Like the leaders were still Sicilian, but the event was otherwise like no different than other parades across the country.
So you're saying the quality of the street food plummeted.
Oh, it trashed. It was absolutely trashed afterwards.
Tragic.
Right? Don't ask about Monterey's gelato.
Yeah, what's Sicilian street food?
I mean, I don't even know if they have real street food. Like Italians don't really do street food. I feel like there must be some kind of weird Italian and California crossover.
Interesting. Looks like there's some pastries.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like seasonal pastries during like celebrations and stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that.
Sfione.
What's the word?
Looks like a big ball.
Oh, is it the fried dough?
Yeah,
Depends where you're from. They're called very different things. What is it in Sicilian?
makes sense. A lot of cultures have fried dough. A lot of different names.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the Sicilian is.
Is it? Wait, hang on. Let me paste something in the chat.
Just dropping in the chat. Fincioni?
That's how you say that?
Yeah.
That's crazy. It starts with an S.
Yeah. It's SF. You just basically ignore the S, basically.
Wow. Fantastic.
You try to like get it as gentle as possible, basically.
Anyway, so you're saying that all the
Sfincioni?
Sfincione rolled right out of Monterey.
Yeah. Hold on, I want to look those up. Hold on, I want to see. Oh, that's like a pizza. It is a street food. Interesting. Ah, that's like Sicilian pizza. That's all that is. That's not what I was thinking of. Is it the same? Sfinci is Sicilian fried dough.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Vincia di San Giuseppe.
San Giuseppe?
Wow. Yeah, kind of butchered that one.
How did you not know how to say Giuseppe?
I don't know.
Come on, man. You're better than this.
Yeah.
Okay, we are getting wildly distracted by desserts.
Pastries, I know these look so good. I guess I'm just hungry for some dessert.
In a lot of Italy, they have something similar to that called zippole, but my family has a different name for it because they speak weird Italian, and I'm blanking on it for some reason, which is just embarrassing. What the hell is it?
Sopranos, they call it like zipple.
Yeah.
They like drop all
they just drop the ends of words because they don't know how to speak Italian. Yeah.
Or is that no, or is it like an Italian American?
Yeah, like there's a little bit of a vowel drop in Italian, but it's usually not as strong as like New Jersey Italians tend to do it.
Gotcha.
That's just like a bastardization, like, where it's supposed to be like a very gentle drop. They're just like mozzarella. You're like, okay, we got it. You think you're fancy? Fuck, I can't remember what it's called. Anyways, what the hell are we talking about?
This Rhode Island Italian beef really hitting that Jersey.
It's what happens, man. That's why they're going to Greece. Okay, so to your point though, what happened in Monterey was that basically like the unique cultural identity really kind of got watered down. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are many lessons that can be taken from like what worked and didn't work for their communities. Oh, Crispell. Of course, now that I'm not thinking about it, that's what we call them, but it's the same thing.
What is it?
Crispell. You're not going to find anything because, again, my family's
right. Your family
fucking
name.
stupid. Well, no, it's like a regional dialect. It's from Abruzzo.
Yeah, from a stupid family.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, it's true. Anyways, I got distracted. I was looking at pictures of fried dough.
We were talking about
lessons learned.
Matriarchy.
Lessons learned.
Federation.
There's definitely things we can learn. So the obvious point to address is that there's structures of matriarchal families where women retained autonomy and confederated together in order to set these boundaries and consistency within the community. Like it worked. You know, you can make an argument about what those boundaries are, but like the the structure itself was effective at keeping the community protected and safe despite all of the marginalization of being non-English speakers in America in the 1920s, 30s. I mean, if you said, like, what is the best case scenario for a group of immigrants in the United States in the 20s and 30s? I would say this is as good as you could expect it to get, right? And to that point, like, decision making was done slowly and collectively and within a greater context. And this was pretty successful, as evidenced by, like, their ability to carve out the space and build economic capital, which is still reflected today. So, for example, a lot of the high value real estate is owned by Sicilians, likely from money invested back in the 1920s and 30s.
Got that sweet, sweet sardine money, brick by brick, can by can.
That's why our people are masons.
Mhm.
Gotta build it brick by brick. And, like, fundamentally, it was accountability which drove the community and its success, right? Even if some took advantage of this system of collaboration. So, for example, some fishermen would go on to buy canneries, and then they would expect and force their family to work for little or no wages. And again, that's the influence of the American culture, I guess, probably could be to blame for that, or they were just shitty people. Further, the Sicilians did often sacrifice those outside of their culture for their own collective gain, as we saw when we think about their, like, apathy towards union organizing, because they didn't want to hurt their own husbands' fishing enterprises. But despite these shortcomings, I think the Sicilian women of Monterey highlight the ways that groups of people with little access to funds can develop, like, a thriving community, and especially as an enclosed or largely enclosed economic ecosystem of support through collective action and collaboration.
Amen, brother.
Fucking A, as the kids say.
Well put.
Thank you. Final thoughts, Matt?
Go eat some sardines. Check them out. They're pretty good.
For the Sicilians, get a fried
Yeah.
bowl of sardines. You'll love them.
Go straight out of the can.
Get them nice and crunchy. Get them fried up.
Mhm.
Chef's kiss.
Or I like fry them up with some eggs.
There you go. That works. Little spice.
No spice.
No spice?
Bland.
Oh.
Keep them bland and fishy.
Fish flavored fish?
Yeah. The olive oil is the spice. God damn it.
It's a lubricant.
You
It's the
people.
lubricant of life, Matt. So, if you guys enjoyed this, go check out the book I referenced earlier, which I don't have the name of in front of me, Beyond Cannery Row by Carol Lynn McKibben. It's a really interesting read. I think if you guys want to learn more about this, that's a good spot to start. Shout out to any Sicilians listening to us. Go check out our Substack to read and get the sources and all that fun stuff. Agroecologies.org. Again, agroecologies.org. And if you want to listen to this episode without commercials, because we also have things to pay for, mostly Matt's sardine habit.
It's an expensive one.
You can support us on Patreon. Patreon.com/
I've been dipping into the smoked oysters recently.
Oh, no.
That's
all right.
Once you go there.
So now you have to subscribe.
Keep the funds rolling, people.
Yeah. Subscribe at Patreon and Substack as a paid subscriber because Matt's living lavishly and someone's got to pay for it.
It's got to go into the tin fish fund. I'm sorry.
And yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I thought it was interesting. I hope it gives people some thoughts about. I think people get really tied up now with, like, the work I do doesn't afford me the opportunity to really think about unionizing because of how segregated I am from the people I work with, my coworkers. And this is kind of that subversive way of thinking about what does it mean to organize outside of that context. So hopefully it sparks something for some folks because I have hope. And I think this is something that'll be more important moving forward is to figure out ways to do this, maybe not based on ethnic lines, but shared values.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Thank you, people, for listening.
Thank you.
And as always, go check out the content and buy our stickers because we've got those too. And I forget to tell people about them. And patches.
They're pretty funny. They're pretty good.
Yeah, I think we just got a new one recently. So go check it out at poorpros.com.
Thank you.